Hello, friends. Brian with City the Immaculata here with you. Tonight we are joined by Avellina Balestri. Avellina is a Catholic author and editor from the historic borderlands of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Her stories, poems, and essays have been featured in over 30 print and online publications. Prior to Gone for a Soldier, she published two books, Saplings of Sherwood, the first book in a Robin Hood retelling series, and Pendragon's Shield, a collection of poetry. She is editor-in-chief of Fellowship and Fairy Dust, a magazine inspiring faith and creativity and exploring the arts through a spiritual lens. Under its auspices, she hosted two literary conferences, one at Oxford University and the other at Cambridge University. She has also represented the state of Maryland at the Sons of the American Revolution National Orations Contest in Greenville, South Carolina. Avellina believes in the Trinitarian divine dance and the incarnational indwelling mystery are reflected in all things good, true, and beautiful, and that the image of God is wondrously woven into every human heart. These are the themes at the forefront of the stories she chooses to tell. Avellina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate the opportunity of being on your show. And, I've enjoyed watching your other interviews that you've given with various people, especially our mutual friend, Philip Campbell, on his book on Irish history. So I'm really honored to be on.
Absolutely. So, Avellina, to get us started tonight, I wanted to ask you if you could talk to me about storytelling. Storytelling in general, how it kind of relates to our past as humans, as Catholics, maybe how narratives shape us. However you see it, what is the significance of storytelling?
So I think that storytelling is a fundamental part of being spiritual beings. We seek meaning, and storytelling is a way in which we engage in that quest. That's how we get the earliest myths and legends. It's always trying to seek a meaning and wisdom and so forth, and we engage in observation of the world around us, but also observation of ourselves. And so I think that that is a fundamental part of who and what we are. And I think that Tolkien captured it very well when he talked about subcreation, that because we are created and a part of the great creation, we have the ability as creatures made in the image and likeness of God to subcreate. And it's something that is sacramental, really. And he used another term, sacramental imagination. So it's something that God gives to us to participate in his creative work. And I think that that's very fundamental to the creative process and makes it a spiritual exercise too when you approach it in that manner.
I'm interested in your own journey into this. What is your own path into the process of telling stories?
So probably it was something very organic, that just there's not really a time in my life when I wasn't telling stories. Even when I was a very small child, I was coming up with stories, sometimes rather elaborate with my toys. I was using whatever I had around me to create narrative. That was very much a driving force for me. And, I think I was crafted by all of the stories that I took in, as a child, whether that be, Disney movies or something, deeper, like, the stories of the saints, or, more fundamental yet, the story of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, which I think is like the beginning point in terms of all the stories that I ended up having a connection with in some deep way. It was because I was seeing a mirror effect of the passion and resurrection. So it's something that continues, I think, to be kind of the pattern which my stories take, that ultimately there's always a kind of cruciform pattern. And again, to use a Tolkien term, like eucatastrophe, something that presents, um, the premise of catastrophe, but in some way or other, there's this deeper undergirding and even trembling hope, to quote the Thomas Gray poem Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which I always really um, had a draw towards, which of course paraphrases the scriptures. But I think that for me is fundamental, that element of hope present in stories that you see reflected from, again, the darkness and light of the Triduum, really. So that's something that's been fundamental for me as a storyteller.
Yeah, it's I always find, and I'm kind of learning this as a father now, where it seems like storytellers are it's like an innate thing that some people are born with, because
Hmm.
my 8-year-old son is one of the most elaborate storytellers that I've ever met, with these like very intricate narratives that he comes up with.
Hmm.
And at times I just kind of wish I had had a tape recorder to record some of them. But um, I think you can kind of judge a society by how they treat their storytellers.
Hmm.
I know there's the famous, Plato wasn't very fond of the poets, and I think there is a certain recognition maybe there where he's acknowledging that there's a certain power and a swaying power over society that maybe the storytellers can have. But I think properly channeled, storytellers are a net positive, and I think they're actually fundamental, which is kind of what you were touching upon there at the beginning, sort of fundamental to our this lived experience that we have. I mean, you take like the French, for example, they are well known to like elevate their poets.
Hmm.
And the English have this like wonderful, rich history of narrative storytelling, and the um, obviously Tolkien touched in on that, but I think Tolkien himself was very much aware that he was tapping into something that was very a part of the English experience, which was
Hmm.
this. And then, maybe the English had lost it for a little while. I don't know what your thoughts on that would be, but he's certainly tapping into something that had been long present within the English psyche.
He wanted to create a myth for England because
Hmm.
he felt in some ways England had been cheated out of that through the Norman conquest. And by
Hmm.
England, he was in some ways meaning the Anglo-Saxons,
Hmm.
and how, due to the Norman conquest, their particular culture was not erased, but was changed due to the Normans and their influence, which did at the same time create a very particular English culture, I would say. I mean, it didn't erase English culture, it created a culture where you have these different elements. And this is actually a big
Hmm.
part of my Robin Hood series. It's very much about how the Saxons and the Normans came to be one people. It's a very, very big theme. But for Tolkien, yeah, he kind of pined in a way over what had been lost, that particular uniqueness of the Anglo-Saxon experience. And in some ways, he was using his imagination in order to think, well, what might an origin myth or a wider mythos in general look like, if the
Hmm.
Anglo-Saxons had remained predominant. But I think that you're right. On a deeper level, he was also trying to give England a sense of mythos back because she was rapidly losing it. And it's strange when you think back on it, when you read people like Tolkien and Lewis and Chesterton and others, and they're saying, we're losing something here in the British Isles. Looking at it then versus now, I mean, the result of the sheer free fall of Britain in terms of her religious awareness, her cultural awareness, her sense of identity, sense of mythos, sense of romance. I mean, in many ways, it has tragically collapsed. So Tolkien almost saw the writing on the wall, and that's why his story is trying to draw from these depths, of the
Mhm.
storytelling tradition, of Europe, really, of kind of Northern European tradition, but particularly, he was definitely drawing on Englishness, both in the sense of the Anglo-Saxon traditions. You see it very strongly in Rohan, very, very much present there. He's literally adapting Anglo-Saxon poetry, like Beowulf and the Battle of Malden, etc., and using it within, the Rohan context. But also, the Wanderer was another big one he was taking from. But also you see it with the Shire. The Shire, I think, takes a lot from his own upbringing before he had to go to the city. The upbringing in the countryside of England at the turn of the century, sort of, before ending up in, the city, industrialized city. And he saw again where things were headed if England's so very long majority agrarian,
Mhm.
so very long, really a country that was in tune with its own self, its own land, was starting to lose those traditional ways of life and modes of being to the machine, if you will.
Mhm.
And so that's why you can see that kind of reflected in Lord of the Rings, the dynamic of, the world he built with regards to Isengard and Mordor and everything. There is a sinister nature to. I don't think the idea is, oh, you can never have any industrialization, but rather the manner of aggressive industrialization, which
Mhm.
eats up, again, the previous natural and more organic, holistic modes of life and traditions. That was what he was seeing. And I mean, interestingly enough, I think that's something that King Charles actually has talked about a lot in his time. And he's really, emphasized his concern about
You're
that.
talking you're
And I
talking about
think it is a valid
the most
one.
you're talking
Mhm.
about the most recent Charles, the Charles now.
Yes. Yes,
Yes.
King Charles III. Yes. So the first and the second were pre-industrialization. So but yeah, so it definitely, I think, is a legitimate concern.
Mhm.
Um, but I think also Tolkien, I mean, I think this is the most fundamental aspect, is that he did write as a Catholic and a Catholic
Mhm.
Englishman. So he has these very particular ways in which he's telling the story that naturally evoke the deepest parts of himself, which are his faith, and the particular expression of his faith as an Englishman. I mean, this is in an age when anti Catholicism was still quite a thing. I mean, it is still quite a thing, to be honest. It's just taken slightly different forms.
Mhm.
But so for him to really lean into that, was deeply admirable, and it took artistic courage.
Well, you seem to have a special interest in the English-speaking world in general, I guess in particular from what I know. And anything, I know you and I haven't had a chance to interact much, but anything I say that's incorrect, feel free to correct me on anything that's about your interest and who you are. But from what I
Mhm.
can gather, in particular, you have it's like from maybe the Robin Hood era, so roughly what 13th century ish, up through
Yeah,
at least to the 18th century. Is this? Am I close here about this?
yeah. So I would say my main spheres of interest are kind of the broad Middle Ages, with a special interest in the Crusading era.
Hmm.
So like I have a particular interest in, the dynamic of those wars, and sort of especially peaking with the Third Crusade involving Richard the Lionheart and Salahuddin.
Mhm.
And so that whole era really fascinates me, but the wider Middle Ages do fascinate me. Um, and then my second main sphere of interest would be the long 18th century, sometimes called the Age of Horse and Musket. or kind of the era of the Second Hundred Years' War, sometimes it's called, because of how often England, which then becomes Britain,
Mhm.
is fighting France. It's almost like one long war with just little breaks between like 1688 and 1815. So kind of the Glorious Revolution era to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. I also have other interests like all around those
Mhm.
eras. Like, I mean, I'm very interested in the Tudor era as well. I have a major devotion to the 40 English martyrs, or sorry, say the 40 martyrs of England and Wales, and the wider martyrology of that time, because obviously there were many more than 40.
Mhm.
And so, that interests me, the whole kind of Stuart era, the English Civil War, and the lead up to the Glorious Revolution, and all of that fascinates me. So yeah, I have a kind of a broad interest, but definitely I would say in the main, I definitely am most interested in the 12th century and the 18th century.
My studies, at least most recently, have been in the high Middle Ages, and I tend to I have a broad scope of interest like yourself, as you were saying, but
Hmm.
also have these very, like, niche, pockets of interest within certain areas.
Hmm.
So in particular, spent a lot of time with the English Grey Friars, i.e., the Franciscans. So my
Yeah.
channel, City of the Immaculata, we have a real emphasis here for all things Franciscan, and and the Grey Friars
Hmm.
were once at Oxford, very
Right.
early in its inception, and they of course imprinted themselves in the minds of the English with their folklores. You take even just a character like Friar Tuck,
Oh
who's
yeah.
sort of this very beloved English character, even well after the Tudor period. But as someone who has studied the later recusant movement, as you were saying, do you have any like indication of where? How do I put this? So w- with Henry VIII, um, we get the dissolution of the monasteries, and there's a
Hmm.
general turn against all things monastic within England. Do you have any idea of the um, how that medieval culture and world and milieu and psyche of the English was sort of upended, or the roots were taken out of it? Because I
Hmm.
know at one time, like I said, these like for the monastics, for example, it was a very integral part of the society and the people to have their monks and their friars, right, to be a part of that, to go from that
Yeah.
to sort of the extremes. And I know the Reformation is uh, kind of like an onslaught on history. But
Mhm.
is there anything that you can say to that, towards that shift in what the medieval world was, maybe moving into what I guess you could call modern
Yeah.
England?
Well, it's interesting, and it's a great question because it kind of plays into how my two current running projects parallel each other. Because the first one is a Robin Hood retelling, called "The Telling of the Beads." It literally refers to the tradition of Robin Hood having Marian devotion and praying the rosary. There's a
Mm,
nursery rhyme that says, Robin Hood telling his beads, all in the green wood among the green reeds." And so there's that. It's a richly, deeply Catholic culture. England, for all of her various societal struggles during this time period when the story takes place, is a deeply, deeply, unquestionably Catholic society. No one would ever think there would be anything else. It's just so much of a given. Everyone, pretty much is a Catholic. I mean, again, barring, like, for example, a minority of the Jewish community that was there for a little while, and some people who leaned more. Like, we had some characters who lean more pagan-ish, who show up in the story from Wales.
mhm,
Um, but at the same time, even with them, I mean, they're more like they're more like, I guess Christo-pagan is kind of a modern term, but it's more like that than any
Mhm.
outright paganism. But they lean more toward older, you know, um, folk beliefs, should I say, and older modes of thinking, and a big theme in the story actually is the lore of the wilderness. So there's a sense of the lore of the wild
Mhm.
always having the potential to cause you to become basically nature worshiping. And so that's always a source of tension, within, I think, the society, that there is this sense that one could kind of lose themselves to that again, regardless of having been converted. But still, as point being, this still was a richly Catholic society.
Mhm.
Then you all of a sudden jump to the secondary project, the trilogy that I'm working on, All Ye That Pass By, and suddenly, now this is the 18th century. This world that we were just in the 12th century story, is rabidly anti-Catholic. It's as if everyone has gone through a mind wipe, basically. Like, they don't remember what they were. They'll remember it in like bits and pieces, but they don't really seem to have this awareness of just how Catholic they were. They've been convinced, they've been brainwashed essentially by the propaganda machine that was underway, especially during the Elizabethan period. That 40-some-year reign wasn't enough time to take a people who were already confused by all the religious changes going back and forth, because you had, as you say, Henry VIII. Yes, he loots the monasteries and everything like that, but fundamentally, he's a schismatic Catholic, right? So he still, for most of his like theological beliefs, is a Catholic. He's just a really bad Catholic who decided, I'm actually the Pope now, and I
Mhm.
can do kind of what I want in terms of declaring my own annulment. But he's not embraced the more radical religious changes that you see going on elsewhere. That actually comes in with his son, Edward VI, and the various, basically, Protestant zealots who were around him as well. Now, people actually are often surprised when I say this, but I actually love Edward VI. He was a good kid.
Mhm.
He really was a much better person than his dad, and he was very pious and he was very sincere. Trouble being that doesn't exactly help when it comes down to the fact that he still was extremely set in his agenda, which he sincerely believed in, that Rome, it was the whore of Babylon, and he was going to save his people from this terrible, terrible thing, and smash the idols essentially. Like the young Josiah. He has been called like the British Josiah by
Mhm.
his fan base, basically. Um, and so this was the way he self-identified, and this was the way people who agreed with that kind of thing saw him. And he and the people around him went on a campaign to really, really force radical religious changes. And this was the kind of thing that changed things. That, you see, ordinarily what it might have been was that the Anglican split might have been more like the Orthodox
Mhm.
situation, where we would still say they would have like valid apostolic succession and holy orders and many of the sacraments. Unfortunately, that changed under Edward because of the changes, the radical changes that were made and that were enforced by him and his ministers with an iron fist, on his part with the best of intentions. Can't speak for all the counselors, but point being that it changed things now radically. Um, so then, of course, his half sister, the Catholic Mary, comes to the throne, and then she tries to switch everything back, and to putting England in union with Rome. That was her goal, with the Holy See.
Mhm.
She made she made some blunders, quite a few, really. She was very well intentioned as well. She and Edward actually shared a very close personality to each other. And that's why they cared about each other a lot, made the whole thing very tragic. They easily could have killed one another. Like, it
Mhm.
got very, very close at certain points. Um, but but yeah, you have a situation where she tries to enforce old form heresy laws, which prior to all of these changes would probably have resulted in like only a handful of people getting executed over a long span of time. Like, that was typical. When England was, you know, you so Catholic that people getting executed for heresy laws were quite rare. But then she puts them back on the books, and because of all of the changes, you're looking at way higher levels of people dying now.
Mhm.
And it was a bad move for a lot of different reasons, but that wasn't the only bad move. There's just a lot of different things, and then there was circumstances that just went wrong, like the fact that she couldn't conceive an heir, the fact that her husband Philip was kind of absentee a lot of the time, and various other just unfortunate things, the timing of her death, and the fact that, her half sister Elizabeth now comes to power, and she is bent upon getting that power back that her dad had. She liked the idea of being head of the church, but honestly, sadly, I would say she didn't even have the same kind of conviction level, it doesn't seem, as her brother Edward. So it's not like I don't get the vibe she was doing it as much out of conviction as she was doing it out of Machiavellian politics. And she decided, hey, having a consolidated kind of power based thing with regards to, I am head of church and state.
Mhm.
That's pretty cool. Why don't I do that? And that was seemingly her goal. And she had 40 years to do it. And she was shrewder and more manipulative, not just her, but her counselors, than frankly her sister or her brother. And so she was better at what she did, so to speak, in terms of being able to use uh, presentation to her benefit. That she was able to keep the sort of the smells and bells elements just enough in order to make people feel like it's not that much of a change,
Mhm.
really. But then to subtly change out doctrine, change out various forms, and emphasize to people this is how you be a good Christian as an Englishman. And this became the sort of the emphasis. Anglicanism
Mhm.
is how you be a good Englishman. And there's like, again, a sort of a mind wipe, is the best way I can put it, about their entire very Catholic, very English past. And suddenly you're being convinced, hey, actually, all of these foreigners, they're the ones who are Catholic. The foreign pope and, France and Spain and all of this, they're the foreigners that we have to worry about here. And we're English. And you know what
Mhm.
Englishmen are? Anglicans.
Mhm.
And so she managed to really, really lean into that, and do the whole thing where she pretended she wasn't persecuting people while setting it up to persecute people. She was way more subtle than both Edward and Mary, but actually more crummy in my opinion, because of the fact that she
Mhm.
was indeed doing that. She would do the whole, I'm not looking into the window of men's souls. You just literally can't practice your faith. You just don't do anything. I won't look into your window of your souls, just like, I mean, literally don't go to mass and all priests are banished. I mean, and then if anything came of the actions that she committed, she always played the victim. And
Mhm.
she was very successful at what she did. She and her ministers, very successful in terms of the kind of mass brainwashing of people, who, and then there's a part of it that people just wanted it to stop the seesaw. I feel like they really got exhausted by that, in the sense of, you know, are we Catholic? Are we Protestant? Are we something in between? I don't know. I just want to get on with my life. And that, Elizabeth offering this, almost what I would say false sense of security or stability, with this sort of settlement, the Elizabethan
Mhm.
settlement, where it's like, we're kind of we're kind of a mashup when you get down to it, of like, we got some Catholic stuff, we got some Calvinist stuff. We're a mix. Um, it was almost like people got to the point where it was like, okay, fine, we're a mix. Let's just go
Yeah.
on with it now. We can't handle it anymore. And so that, I think is the thing that makes it so interesting in the writing process for me, that you go from writing this one world, which on the one hand has a lot of similarities to this other world in timeline, because both stories, both the Robin Hood series and the what becomes American Revolution series, both open in agrarian England,
Hmm.
among farm folk in the country, deep country of Mother England. And in many ways, not very much has changed, and in other ways, everything has changed. And so that was interesting for me in the writing process to realize just how radical the effects of the Elizabethan settlement and her successors after that were in changing the narrative and doing like erasure, really.
Wonderful answer. Thank you. Where I
You're
was
welcome.
saying was that I think by the time you get to the end of Elizabeth's reign, it just is kind of amazing to me how far the degradation of the Catholic Church in England, how far it went. Because
Mhm.
yeah, as you began with that, by all accounts, by the beginning, from certainly up through Edward the Seventh's reign, and even Edward the Eighth's reign. I mean, many people forget that with Edward the Eighth, until things went south with the King's Great Matter, he got the title the Defender of the Faith, and
Henry VIII, yeah.
there was this strong element of Catholic identity within the church. I mean, so with the like one of the interesting things I find is you will see like one of the challenges that Anglicans up to our very own day they struggle with, for example, like certain teachings on Mary,
Hmm.
Mariology, whereas with the medieval English from Blessed John Duns Scotus coming out of Oxford,
Hmm.
and he was actually his tradition was being born out of Anselm of Canterbury's theology,
Hmm.
which was born out of the feast of Our Lady's Immaculate Conception, which was very unique. It wasn't so much widespread on the continent, whereas it was in England. So England actually, as it comes through the Middle Ages, is known as the Dowry of Mary.
Absolutely. It was a very Marian country. I mean,
Hmm.
there are multiple different references to it in chronicles
Hmm.
and annals, in which it basically says, oh, you know, yes, through all Christendom, Mary is of course greatly honored, but in
Hmm.
England,
Hmm.
that is truly where Marian devotion is the strongest. And it's heartbreaking. It's truly heartbreaking that it goes from that to the point where you have, I mean, the test acts. This is something that is a major focus in the All Ye That Pass By trilogy. The test acts very explicitly say you must disavow Marian devotion.
Hmm.
To be considered now a true and good Englishman, you must disavow something that was so absolutely fundamental to being an Englishman at a certain point. I mean, it reminds me of something else that gets mentioned in the trilogy, but the Percy family. Not to get into a whole long thing, but they used to be considered very, very Catholic, to the point where Thomas Percy, when he was going to be executed for a rebellion against Elizabeth I in favor of Mary, Queen of Scots, when they are trying to get him to basically apostatize to save his life, he responds simply, I am a Percy in life and death. His name to him was actually associated with his faith. They were one and the same. To
Hmm.
be a Percy meant to be a good Catholic. And it's so interesting how you take that sort of background where the Percys like self-identify, this old ancient medieval family. You run into them with all these border ballads, with the Scots and the English fighting over the border reivers in the Middle Ages and everything. The Ballad of the Chevy Chase, and this old medieval family identifies itself strongly as being Catholic. They're the ones that spearhead, among other families of the North, the army of the Five Wounds and the whole, kind of risings of the North, the Pilgrimage of Grace, etc. And then you fast forward, though, to the time of the trilogy taking place, the 18th century. And where do we find the Percys? Well, we find Lord Hugh Percy, the Earl Percy, who becomes very famous due to Lexington and Concord. But the family has given up their faith. The family that once was I am a Percy in life and death, which is synonymous with its Catholicism, is no longer Catholic. They have effectively sold the farm. And so we get to run into Hugh Percy, and the main recusant fictional character, Ned, can't help but think about it and be like, this is where the family is at currently versus, how they understood themselves some generations ago.
Well, that kind of was it's a nice transition because, um, where I was kind of going in my mind too, this is, with what happened with Mary, and I appreciate you actually saying that there were some, challenging things about Mary because I feel like, as we Catholics, especially of, the English-speaking world, try to reestablish some of our identity, I feel like there's an
Mm-hmm.
attempt at times to, um, excuse certain faults of the Catholic monarchs of this period, because Mary, for example, when she was in power, she did not attempt to restore the monasteries. She kind of knew that power where that money had channeled to. And then by the time you get to Elizabeth, I think there's a tendency to, where Elizabeth at one time had, good Queen Bess and the Virgin Queen
Mm-hmm.
and all of these things, to make her out to be more of an enemy of the church than what she was. Whereas I think, like what you were expressing, this is a period where, without neglecting the, religion as an impetus for some of these changes, there was also a certain national identity that's beginning to form.
It
And
was
I
the
think,
beginning of nation states. The beginning of
yes.
nation states as a concept was starting to affect the way that people viewed themselves and viewed the
Mhm,
idea of Christendom.
mhm,
So Christendom used to be the higher thing, quite frankly, but also the idea that kings and queens like the way in which things were structured. It was like, well,
mhm,
there's a king or sometimes a queen, and they have dominion over a certain area of territory, right?
mhm,
It's not so much the nation state is not set in stone. It's not non-existent, because some people make it like completely non-existent. It's not that, but it is not nearly as defined.
mhm,
It's there's way more room to move, and you have the great families like I just mentioned with like the Percys and the Douglases right across the border in Scotland, and they're always on this moving border and claiming lands. This is Percy land, this is Douglas land. It was more personal, if that makes
mhm,
sense,
mhm,
connected to the person of the monarch or the lord or what have you. And I think that things shifting, it was interesting because on the one hand, you had the monarchs, like you said, like Mary and like Elizabeth, who were both complex women. Mary, by far, was the more pious one, though. I mean, she
mhm.
made various mistakes, but she was more genuinely devout, like her brother Edward was genuinely devout. I wouldn't say Elizabeth wasn't at all. Like, I don't. She wasn't like an atheist or something,
Mhm.
but her motives and her actions and her general life seems to reflect that she was far more interested in the political settlement, than the religious settlement, than her brother or her sister. And also more
Would it be
so.
fair to say that she was maybe, I mean, we're living in a post-Machiavellian world at that point, and I think her
Mhm.
political astuteness, and I think you were actually even, mentioning that earlier, like, her political
Mhm.
astuteness sort of trumped all else. Even
Yes,
to the
yes,
fact that she, to at a certain point there was, especially after the Spanish Armada, it wasn't that they were going as Catholics qua Catholics, they were going as Catholics as this subversive people that were, informants for Spain or informants for Rome, for example,
absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. She was very much I mean she and her ministers. Again, every time I say like she,
Mm,
this comes in a lot later on. In fact, when people when they'll say like King George the Third did, I'm like usually that
mm,
means like a ton of people around him as well. But
mm,
but still at the same time, yeah, she, to say it for simplicity, was certainly trying to use the domino effects, quite frankly, of her own actions in order to build up a narrative. So, so for example, she takes power again as a head of church and state, and then she outlaws the mass and Catholic priests. Well, that's going to have its repercussions in all different ways, politically and religiously. When those repercussions start to happen, she doesn't take any responsibility for her own actions, but simply blames the Catholics and paints them as the evil ones. Now, now, I think we can legitimately say the Pope made a political blunder in excommunicating her.
mhm,
Yes, he was. Let's put it this way: she was almost begging to be excommunicated.
mm,
The stuff that she did was totally excommunicatable. But at the same time, especially the wording being used and the changes happening in Europe were such that she was going to seize upon that as an excuse to persecute the heck out of Catholics in a
mhm,
much stronger way. She already had been persecuting them, by the way. It wasn't like, oh, this just happened in response. Some Anglicans I've run into will kind of paint it that way. It's not. It was already
mm.
happening. But she used it, she and her ministers, as an excuse because of the definitely the implications of the sometimes very direct that if you're an excommunicated monarch, your subjects are relieved of their allegiance to you effectively. So this is what begins the whole question of are to be a Catholic is to be a traitor, etc., etc. And it was a blunder. It was a political blunder that cost many more Catholic lives because of the fact that Elizabeth was going to use it to the max.
And I don't
And it was,
actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I actually, this is an interesting point to bring up, because I don't think, well, one, I think Rome kind of learned its lesson and it became very sensitive to the fact that we are kind of living in a new world. And,
yeah.
that mistake that Pope Pius V made there with his excommunication of Elizabeth, you see later when the popes, for example, are dealing with Napoleon and they're willing to sign a concordat, or when they're dealing with the Nazi
Mhm.
party and they're willing to sign a concordat, they get a lot of flack for that by certain people. But the reality is, in the context, I think plays exactly into the
Absolutely.
lessons that were learned at this point of what you potentially put Catholic citizens living in a certain place if the papacy turns against the government of that place.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that was like the thing is that the Pope at the time was acting like popes of the past who would do things like that, excommunication or put different, um,
The
bans
yeah,
up,
inter
all different kinds of things in
the
order to
interdicts.
discipline. Yeah, exactly. Interdicts. There we go. In order to discipline the monarchs who had gone astray and bring them back into line. And that was something that had worked in the past at many points. So I understand what he was going for, but it was a different world. It wasn't going to work. It was just going to make life absolutely hell for English Catholics, and give Elizabeth everything she wanted. I mean, that literally, it was giving her on a platter the kind of propaganda she wanted. Same thing with regards to the whole Spanish Armada debacle. What's ironic, of course, is that when you think of the Spanish Armada as compared to the Glorious Revolution, there was a lot of similarities. It's just one side gets remembered, oh, so fondly because it was the Protestants and they had control of the propaganda. But it's about a foreign prince, it's essentially being set up as the new monarch in order to establish or maintain a certain religious slash political power base. But of course, the way that Elizabeth, and co would spin that is that, it is, very much of a existential threat to England. And quite frankly, it was in its own way. And the fact that even many Catholic English people weren't in favor of the Armada, it was like a, mixed bag on that one, showed that it was politically unwise to back something like that in the case of the Pope. It just made things look a lot worse, and it fed into Elizabeth's propaganda machine, and many Catholics didn't want it anyway because they still felt like Englishmen. At the end of the day, they were going to defend their own land. So it didn't work right for a lot of different reasons. Yeah, of course, to be fair, the Armada happened as a result of a number of things. It didn't just come out of nowhere. Number one, it was in the aftermath of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, which is another whole barrel of wax. And number two, it happened because Elizabeth's, sea dogs, her kind of privateers, were attacking Spanish shipping and colonies. So it wasn't just come out of the wild blue, as it's often treated, but it still was a situation where it deepened the divide. Let's just put it that way. Between England and the Catholic foreign world, and it played into Elizabeth's propaganda machine beautifully. So, yeah, you just had a situation where things kept getting worse and worse, and then when you swing around to, like, for example, the gunpowder plot in the reign of James the First, which just passed, bonfire night and everything on November 5th. So things just get worse and worse in terms of cause and effect, because usually it really has to do with the fact that, Catholics very legitimately are sick of being persecuted and are trying to liberate themselves. But then they end up doing stuff which, quite frankly, when you look at it, is rather dumb and of questionable morality because of desperation. And then of course, once that happens, it gets used by the propaganda machine to brainwash even harder more people, to the point where they really are convinced that at a certain point that, I'm thinking of, oh my gosh, the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, who is quite famous, well, for a lot of stuff, but one of the things he's famous for is jumping sides from James II, the Catholic convert steward, over to William of Orange, the Protestant son-in-law of James during the Glorious Revolution. And it's amazing to me sometimes. Like, I've read a ton of the man's letters and have transcribed some of them. And it's amazing to me sometimes where it's kind of like, you almost feel like it's like a Rodgers and Hammerstein moment where it's like, impossible for a man to be English and also to be Catholic. And he's sort of going through this sort of thing that it's impossible. It doesn't exist. There's no way in which a man, much less a king, can be both English and Catholic. And this is his justification for what he does to James ultimately. And he and many other people were quite frankly, I believe, sincere about that. They were just super brainwashed. And it's deeply sad. And it's also strange in its own way, especially with Marlborough, because this is a guy who he claims he's the farthest thing from Rome, in doctrine and conviction and persuasion, and he goes on and on about that. But this is a man who has Eucharistic devotion in as far as his, he's a man who is devoted to receiving Anglican Holy Communion in a way that can only be called very Catholic in instinct. He's a man who knows that, if you're in danger of death, you should receive Holy Communion. It's very important to do so. and he will go out of his way in order to do so. He's a man who will receive on his knees in the mud. And there's something very striking about it in a melancholic, bittersweet way. The notion of Marlborough, the great sort of famous, glorious revolution figure, who later, in one of the famous sequences, um, previous to the Battle of Blenheim and the Battle of Ramillies and the War of Spanish Succession. He's a man who, in his always pristine clothing, um, his pristine uniform and pristine appearance, will still be instantly down on his knees in the mud receiving communion. It's a deep, deep tragedy. It's a deep, I think, tragedy because of, well, of course, from Catholic point of view, it's not really, it's not really the sacrament. Number one, um,
Hmm.
I do think that it's a form of spiritual communion if someone is that genuine about it. But it's still a tragedy nevertheless. Um, and also the fact that it harkens back to older things he himself denies. Like there's this wonderful tradition of knights from the Middle Ages period. You see it recorded in the Hundred Years' War, like at the Battle of Agincourt, that the English knights who couldn't receive communion beforehand, all at once, and that the English soldiery, what they do is they put a clump of earth in their mouth as a sign of longing and mortality, and in response to not being able to receive the Eucharist. And there's that intense longing and understanding of the need to be fed, which Marlborough still has, even though he is part of the machinery that has cut itself off from the source that actually gives you the food. So it's all a deep tragedy and very much of an allegory for England herself.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate the significance of the reign of Charles I and the Caroline
Mhm.
divines who came in the wake of that, and the attempt of those theologians to sort of restore some of that Catholicity that had been
Mhm.
lost. And you're right; it is tragic for us as Catholics. I always applaud and I always laud Anglicans that attempt to be more Catholic, but there is a certain like weeping tragedy that's involved with the fact that they did. You can't just erase what happened in the Reformation and the earlier periods where
No,
they lost the validity of their sacraments.
that's the problem, really. It's that they want to be the Orthodox, many high church Anglicans, and it's one of those things where it it's I honestly feel like this is almost an interesting thing for me. I often feel more comfortable with sort of outright Protestant, kind of identifying Anglicans, as opposed to high church ones who I feel like should just be Catholic at this point.
Mhm.
Like, in other words, there's like a sense of, look, you guys are so Catholic that you just should acknowledge the problems here, and come this way. And oftentimes they won't do so. And I want to be careful saying this because I know my Anglican friends will end up watching this. Oh my goodness. Okay. But, yeah, no. So I guess I'll just say that high Anglicans, on the one hand, really do have my heart and affection for the fact that they do have this draw to ancient beauty. On the other hand, the fact that they are so close to us, and in many times just won't come over anyway, is, I think, sometimes a case of nationalism,
Mhm.
and sometimes a case of almost making the trappings more important than the substance. I've got to say, and I don't mean this in a, like, oh, they just care about the. I understand that they have deeper things than merely the trappings, but at the same time, there is a tendency, I think, sometimes for them to put an emphasis on it, which prevents them from seeing the substantial problems, and they don't want to become Catholic because they might lose the trappings. And I mean, that's a tragedy. It really is a tragedy in another whole way, because I wish they would come and fix the Catholic Church in England, which in many ways suffers from excessive modernism in a lot of different ways.
Mhm.
So there's ways in which I wish that more of that. I wish they could bring their you know, their buildings with them, quite frankly, and
Yeah.
so forth. So there's that kind of thing, which is a whole tragedy in and of itself. But sometimes I feel almost uncomfortable due to the closeness of it, and yet they won't make the final sort of leap. Whereas I feel like a broad church or low church Anglicans, I can understand better. Like they have substantial differences with us, so it's like,
Mhm.
okay, I kind of, I get that, I respect that, but it's hard for me to respect someone who's that Catholic not just becoming Catholic.
You may be interested, in the next when am I gonna do it? I guess it's not this coming week. The following week, I have a live scheduled where I'm actually gonna go into some of the, um, arguments that came out of the Oxford movement in the 19th
Mhm.
century and sort of play into how, while I respect the Oxford movement in many ways, and I'm a huge fan of Saint John Henry Newman, there
Mhm.
were some serious inconsistencies when trying to read back into the early period of the Reformation, and how I think how John Henry Newman rightly came to the conclusions that he did,
Yeah.
which is making that next step that you're talking about that a lot of them struggle to make. But that isn't to say that men like Edward Pusey didn't have. Uh, it's not to say that they didn't have their arguments, but that's
Yeah.
that'll be for those of people that are watching the audience. I don't want to like completely derail into like a theology discussion. I would like to maybe transfer the conversation a little bit towards your most recent book,
Mhm.
because I think it's actually really pertinent to this whole conversation. I guess the first thing that would have to do, in order to leave, Elizabeth. Let's see. Can I do a quick synopsis? What happens in the meantime? So Elizabeth dies. She doesn't have an heir. James comes down from Scotland, becomes the king of England and Scotland, basically creating at that point the British Empire. And then fast forward, you get to Charles I and the revolution around the English Civil War. The Puritans take over. Charles is beheaded. Let's see, Cromwell takes power. Cromwell dies. There's the restoration period of the monarchy. And then that is seen as being too influenced by Catholic monarchs, particularly Charles II. And who was the other? Was it James?
James the
Um,
Second was his
James,
brother, who was
James,
a Catholic convert.
and so then you get the Glorious Revolution, so-called Glorious Revolution,
Mhm.
and at that point, you're starting to really begin to see the, I think, and this is maybe where you can help fill me in, the British Empire and the British identity that modernity would really recognize or begin to
Mhm.
recognize. And I want to say that that kind of leads us up to the doorstep of where your trilogy is taking place, correct?
Mhm. Yes. So that was a very good summary, by the way. You did a
Thank
nice,
you.
succinct summary. I know there's so much to, boil down with, with this history stuff and so many layers. So you did a good job on that. Um, but yeah, so basically it does where we open so basically, yeah, under, as you said, under James the First, you have the union of the crowns, which takes place. So, in other words, he is king of both England and Scotland, but also of Wales and Ireland too. So the whole British Isles is under one king, and he has very particular goals too, in terms of, hey, I want long term to make even more of a union here and get a unified entity. And as you say, it is the beginnings of what becomes the British Empire. I mean, technically, they began under geez, I mean, the first explorations out to the New World, the very, very beginning ones, were under like Henry VII. So it's like,
Mhm.
but I would say it's fair to say that the British Empire began and it's really like starting up form under Elizabeth with Roanoke and everything, but really now started to actually have lasting effects under James with
Mhm.
Jamestown, etc. So James becomes and then of course the Plymouth colony, and everything else. So you have that real catalyst for setting up colonies in the New World, by not just English adventurers like down in Jamestown, but families, and some driven by religious persecution of different degrees. So that becomes a whole thing, and this is the New World, of course, which is going to affect the story and trilogy that I'm telling. But yeah, and then under, as you say, so it's the beginnings of the wider British Empire, and then it expands under the subsequent Stuart monarchs. Like think about my homeland of Maryland, the Catholic colony. Lord Baltimore establishes that under Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria, which it's in part named after and in part the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so you get all of these founded colonies happening through the various reigns that are occurring. And it becomes, more of a substantial, entity connection to the wider British sphere. Un- Under Queen Anne, you get the beginnings of what is actually now unified Great Britain, because not only does do they have the union of the crowns, but they have now the union of the parliaments, military, etc. The military element, I find particularly fascinating how that came together even a bit before the parliaments through our friend the Duke of Marlborough.
Mm.
He was probably England's great military genius, to be honest, the kind of indispensable military man. He doesn't get nearly enough credit these days in terms of focus, as he should. But that's a whole other thing. But he is very much referenced in the trilogy, and he was very much of a a focal point of later, generations, because basically the trilogy opens as the key, um, in 1774 officially, and we reference back in time to the 50s and 60s, 1750s and 60s, and leading up material. But it opens officially in 74, so we get a lot of flashback material, sort of the story so far. And the idea is that this is Britain as she's just starting to emerge as a united entity and as a world power now, because not only has she settled these colonies, but she has proven successful at times when she didn't think she was going to be, in outdoing first Spain, which fell into, kind of the Shadowlands in many
Mhm.
ways in terms of its real prominence, and now France. So what we get with the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War, as it's called, is a lead up of various defeats that the British inflicted on the French, starting with Marlborough, with regards to the War of Spanish Succession. He was sort of the beginning of it. And then with the War of Austrian Succession, and then finally with the 7 Years / French and Indian War, where Britain, even again at points, the French and Indian War was one of those things that Britain actually took a lot of hard hits, so it wasn't like an instant win or anything. But yeah, they were proving their sort of superiority in the empire game, and so Britain has this real sense of optimism on the one hand of who they are and what they're becoming. They're the island nation that rules the waves, and that has this empire, that is growing from strength to strength. And so there's this real sense of optimism, even as it runs alongside of real economic troubles from these wars. And so that's the environment in which we meet Edmund Southworth, and he is the main character, also known as Ned, mostly called
Mhm.
Ned in the trilogy. And he's a young man from a Catholic recusant family in Lancashire, in the north of England. a county that had, and I believe still does have, the highest majority of recusant like Catholics then and Catholic descendants now. So it was a very, it had a very particular subculture connected to it, of having a reasonably sized Catholic minority. And Ned is introduced as this young man who his again, his family used to be quite upscale, like from noble blood, but due to all of the penalties and fines and taxes levied on Catholics, they have lost a lot of their prestige. They're really, really reduced. And so you have young Ned, and we show that as a child he plays army, plays soldiers with his Protestant friends as little kids. And the big rage of the day, the focus, was General James Wolfe's triumph over the French, the Battle of Quebec, ending the French and Indian War. And so they will play, various games where they take turns playing wolf and putting little pieces of scarlet fabric and pinning it to their clothes. And it's very much the environment he's in, this environment of patriotism and martial ardor. And yet he's a Catholic, and he's always going to be treated differently and treated as an outsider.
Can you actually
Sort of.
define for the audience, I think at this point, recusant actually takes on a legal definition, right? Is it,
Oh, yes. So a
it's
recusant
not just
means
it's
one.
not just a pejorative, it's actually has, like, legal ramifications.
Oh, absolutely, yes. So a recusant means one who refuses. And what it meant, in this case, was one who refused to take the oaths and acts passed by Parliament pertaining to, the religious claims of the monarchs. So basically, Catholic recusants were, it was mainly used regarding Catholics. These were what these oaths and acts were mainly directed against Catholics. You could tell even in the wording and writing. But you did have other types of recusants too. So, for example, they were, could range really in terms of Presbyterians, hardcore Presbyterians who didn't want to take it, Quakers, some Baptists, some Congregationalists, Puritans could even fall in this category. So it really depended on the time frame. Even like non-juring Anglicans in the aftermath of, like, say, the English Civil War or the Jacobite period, like you have basically the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, non-juring Anglicans would themselves sometimes be considered recusants. It was like a term that could be a bit fluid, but usually, in the main, probably about 80% of the time, they're talking about Catholics, to the point where it can be used almost interchangeably a lot. In when people are referring to recusants, they usually mean Catholics. So you have of course, the oath of supremacy is the famous one with Henry VIII, which starts the whole ball rolling, and it lasts through the Tudor period with Elizabeth and so forth. But then you have all kinds of fun stuff regarding so many different types of acts that pass in the aftermath, all with a similar purpose. The goal is to essentially get Catholics to apostatize. That's the
Mhm.
simple goal. And so you're supposed to, disavow the Pope, but then also disavow so many other aspects of Catholic teaching, including very specifically, as I mentioned earlier, Marian devotion, belief in the communion of saints, transubstantiation. I mean, it was very particular, very clearly
Mhm.
geared toward Catholics. So much so, some Presbyterians, it's sort of a fun thing, quite a few, in fact, were persuaded to take the oath just by saying, "Hey, look, you guys, look, we're all Protestants here, okay? This is geared at Catholics, really. It
Mm.
is. Like, you don't have to react so much. If you don't like the king claiming to be head of, the church, or governor of the church at this point, look, the king, after the Glorious Revolution, they came to this compromise, right? Where the monarchs, to this day, in fact, you can observe it, all of the footage of the oaths and acts and stuff that Charles III took upon ascending to the throne. It included becoming governor of the Church of England and a member of the Kirk in Scotland. And so that was the sort of compromise. So he's saying, okay, so fine, he's claiming to be like head or whatever of the church in England, but if you're a Scottish Presbyterian or whatever, he's also a member of the Kirk in Scotland, so he's kind of both. So you can kind of just swallow the act. We know with technicalities, but you're a Protestant and we're Protestants and we're just trying to stick it to the papists. So don't get so hung up on it. And lots of Presbyterians went that way and just said, okay, we'll read between the lines here and go with that compromise. It was mainly geared toward Catholics, and so that's why the various test acts, right, are passed through the whole penal laws period that afflicts the entire British Isles and most of the wider British Empire.
I think so. With your story, this is going to be a trilogy. Do you have an idea yet of where you? And I don't, without like no spoiler alerts, where you plan to like end it at, like at like what period yet, or is that still out to be determined?
The Gordon riots, the
The
Gordon
Gordon
riots of 1780, these
1780. Okay,
anti-Catholic riots. hmm
so that's
So,
actually.
so yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, no. I'm just gonna say, yeah. So basically, just to give the audience an idea of the very basic premise. Um, yeah. So Ned, our main character, um, grows up in this environment where he is considered a kind of a coward at best, a traitor at worst in many cases. This
Mm,
is how Catholics were deemed, even in areas which were not as bad as others. Like Ned's family is allowed to exist, but they were always in danger when they actually try to outwardly practice, not even outwardly, hidden practice their faith. The age of priest holes was not over. People
mhm.
forget this. They think of the priest holes in like Elizabethan context and then, oh, it just kind of goes away. No, it doesn't. All the way into the 1700s, priests are not allowed in most cases. Now there's exceptions to these rules, but generally speaking, Catholic priests are not allowed in England. If they're caught, they can either be banished or life imprisonment, which in this time period had an average life expectancy of like half a year. So yeah, it's not, they're not hang drawing and quartering the priests, but there are heavy penalties
Mhm.
involved. And the people who harbor him can lose everything that they have basically. And there's a very precariousness about the position of Catholics in this period, where there's these different laws that are brought forward at different points that just deprive them of so many different things. And we get to see that a little bit with Ned's day to day existence. That on the one hand, he's this noble, but they obviously are down on their luck monetarily and just struggling to hold on to the house, which legally they shouldn't have. And this is something they really shouldn't have any land. They shouldn't have the house. The only reason that they do is something quite common, especially in areas where the Catholic minority was sizable, is that the local authorities would let this stuff slide if they didn't want to upset the apple cart. So they would
Mm,
just be like, okay, we'll just leave it go. So they have the house, but they can lose it at any point if the local government on a dime just switches. And this kind of thing happened a lot, and it's something we reference as well. That for Catholics, they could be going along fine, and then all of a sudden some global event happens which kicks off anti-Catholicism. And then suddenly the government gets super anti-Catholic in kind of a frenzy, and they lose everything. But also Ned, as a young nobleman, he can't keep up with his peers the way that one would like, in the sense of he is a Catholic. He can't own weaponry, so he's not allowed to go hunting. He's a Catholic. He can't own a horse. He's not, allowed to go riding. And again, this fluctuated different periods, but at this point, he's not supposed to. He walks everywhere. Um, he's a Catholic. He can't go to the prestigious universities like Oxford and Cambridge. He's a Catholic. He certainly can't run for politics. I mean, he can't even vote. He's a Catholic. He can't join these gentlemen clubs. A lot of
mm.
them, some of them you can, but a lot of them no. He's a Catholic, and this goes on and on and on. Essentially, he can't join the military, which is the main point here. That as a little kid, he has this dream that's based off of the sort of the romance in some ways of the scarlet tunics and the sparkling buttons, but also because of, yes, the stories of heroism and whatnot you find in General Wolfe, etc., and the desire to be a part of that and be accepted by your community and your country and the rest of it. So he finds himself in this real struggle to live like this, and to be set aside. And what is the catalyst for the story taking place and shifting in a particular way is General John Burgoyne, of Battle of Saratoga fame, or Campaign of Saratoga fame,
Hmm.
who in our storyline is a friend of Ned's father, who passes away early on in the story. And Ned's dad lent Burgoyne money. And Burgoyne was always coming in and out of money. Like, he was a gambler. He had very high tastes in wine, women, and song, and he was spending money recklessly all his life. And then making poor choices with the racing horses, and getting into all other forms of mischief. He was such a colorful character, but he also could be very generous to his friends. He was quite charitable with raising money through benefits. He was a playwright and a production manager of stuff, and he was an interesting and very multifaceted character. But he comes into Ned's life and he helps them financially after his father dies. And then he takes Ned sort of under his wing, and they go touring in London together. And they see each other regularly after that up in Lancashire, and they have this whole connection with one another. And as the time goes by and things happen across the sea in America, Burgoyne ends up, of course, being drawn into the war. As first as someone who goes over to Massachusetts during that, kind of prelude to war, and then the actual war kind of, really beginning in earnest. Um, and then he ends up in Canada as well to, for the deflection of attack on Canada by Benedict Arnold
Mhm.
and Richard Montgomery, and Arnold still being on the revolutionary side. And then ultimately Burgoyne gets permission to launch his super plan, the Albany campaign, it was originally called, which he's going to plan on splitting the colonies in two by a three-prong meetup, basically, that will cut, off the Hudson River and link up at Albany, and he believes that will end the rebellion. And so in our story, he goes to Ned and he tries to persuade him, "Come with me, boy, come with me. Come with me on this campaign, and sort of, there's nothing I won't do for you." To try to help you get a career in the military and, go from strength to strength, like the burgeoning empire. And that's really what starts to make the story, what it is. That the fundamental part of this, I mean, I might as well give away the spoiler because people will know anyway from the back, that Ned ultimately does cave. He
Mhm.
takes the test out, and he does, you know, become an aide de camp on Burgoyne's staff. And he goes to the American Revolution, he goes to the Saratoga campaign, and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. And this is where he begins to ask the hard questions. Like, what have I done?
Hmm.
Where you've sacrificed everything, your own soul essentially, in order to go on this campaign. And you were led to believe it was going to be this glorious thing. It was going to be like Quebec, and then you are literally living a nightmare. I mean, the Saratoga campaign was a pure nightmare fuel for the British and their allies to part in this thing. So it really does force him to ask himself questions about what is the highest good, and what are lesser goods, and how do they fit properly in the hierarchy of being.
I think it's a really unique time period that you've placed this in because had it been set any later, obviously you would have been going into the period of the French Revolution and the
Mhm,
Napoleon Wars, which in my mind really, there's so many like pivot points where you can stress modernity. But I think by the
mhm.
time you get to Napoleon, there's no going back.
Yeah,
That was
I would
like the
agree.
complete, upending where even some of the things that were happening in the period that you're writing about here. For example, later, you would get somebody like Lord Nelson, who, when he dies, he's interred in Westminster Abbey, right? So at this
Mhm.
point, like, what even is the Anglican Church, and what
Yeah.
even
He ended up
is
at St. Paul's actually.
was it?
Saint, yeah, Saint. So it's kind of funny, not to get off on a tangent, but
Yeah.
Nelson and Wellington are both at St. Paul's. Um, but it's sort of, I don't know, it always is slightly humorous to me because Wellington couldn't quite handle Nelson. He thought he was very braggadocious and over the top. And I
Nelson
was just
was,
sort
I
of
mean, he was a bigamist, and yeah, he was.
well, Nelson, the thing is, okay, I really like Nelson for various things, but yes,
Mhm.
he was deeply flawed in various ways. Adulterer, very much so.
Yeah.
And you know, he he was he was one of those people who's a very flawed hero.
Hmm.
And he was very liked to talk up a game. He was very much the bragging type. And very showmanship. He had
Mhm.
showmanship, right? Wellington was introverted and steely and did not wear his emotions on his sleeve. And so even though he had deep emotions, I mean, we know
Mhm.
this from his crying in the aftermath of Waterloo, which just freaked everyone the heck out because he was so normally
Mhm.
self-contained. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, yes, Nelson could be rather the showman and could come off very braggadocious that way. So I just find it funny though that they are now at rest together,
Yeah.
in St. Paul's. But you're right about the fact. I think what you're pointing out is that these characters are indeed becoming secular saints, right?
Mhm.
In the psyche. And starts with Wolfe, for example. I mean, to tie in Wolfe and Nelson, um you've got the famous painting, The Death of General Wolfe by Benjamin West. And Nelson, I mean, he grew up just like Ned in my story, idolizing Wolfe and loving the painting. And the painting is very much an imitation of religious art. You can
Mhm.
see very clearly that it is both utilizing elements of the Pieta. Very clearly, you can see that, but also the Last Supper. And it really has, and other things like, for example, art to do with Saint Sebastian or the martyrs, other martyrs. You can see it very much. The emphasis upon Wolfe as like a secular martyr. And interestingly, when the British took Quebec, they ended up actually taking down various saint statues and putting up, statues of Wolfe, etc. And I mean, disclaimer, I love Wolfe. I call him my British spirit animal. I've read like most of his letters and I have a deep personal connection to him. But, he ain't a saint. And so that is one of those things where you had something going on in Britain
Well, I
where
also think
because they had yeah.
no, but I was also gonna go too, where I think there was a particular reordering of and E Europe as a whole, because I just think that the French Revolution so upset everything. So by the time you get to Waterloo and the aftermath, you have Wellington
Mhm.
and Metternich, basically reestablishing what Europe landscape was gonna look like in an attempt to restore, the old
Order.
order as it was, right? So I think at that point, you've got the, is it Tredegar in Spain,
Mhm.
where the English are working into conjunction with the Spanish. They're mortal enemies, right? But now you've got this unstoppable force of Napoleon and the French
Right.
Revolution. And so I think at that point, it's a sort of internal, um, at in the aftermath of all of that, you're basically we begin the period of the modern day, like left, liberal, conservative, right. Those
Yeah,
that
it
spectrum
set
is
the stage
created,
for it. The spectrum is created. Yeah, I would agree. And
and out of
yeah,
that,
no, and
sorry,
out of
I
that,
am actually going to give you a platform here to run with, but out of that, yeah, I think you get a British eventually having to lax their laws towards the Catholics, whereas in this period, I think where you're set in, there's still sort of an idealism. They haven't lost the War of American Independence quite yet.
right.
And so the idea of the empire, like you said, is sort of coming into fruition. Where I think if you had said it later, you'd be dealing with a totally different Britain at that point. So yeah, I just wanted to say I think that was an interesting place for you to set the story you're telling.
Yeah, no, yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, yeah, no, and I think that it is like you say, where the Napoleonic Wars does set up different dynamics. Where again you have uh the Enlightenment era, which kind of brought about many different chain reactions, as you say, the French Revolution. Well, the American Revolution led to the French Revolution, which led to the
Mhm,
rise of Napoleon, which led to the rubrics of the world being set in a very particular way that came with pros and cons, goods and ills. um but you know it is something where I would say the Anglican split again, just to touch briefly back on the thing with Wolfe, and Nelson for that matter, and all of them. The Anglican split was in a way part of what started the modernity wheels turning, um, because you had again this sort of secular secular emphasis being placed on figures like Wolfe, leaning into the notions of the Greco-Romans because of the Enlightenment. And you get it where you have like the irony of Nelson said, I would be glad to die in battle if I could just get Benjamin West to do a painting of me dying. And Benjamin West actually did end up doing that.
mm,
Unfortunately, it was considered like his swan song painting
mm,
and wasn't, nearly as popular or focused upon as the Wolf one. You can kind of tell why when you see the two of them next to each other. But yeah, it was one of these things where the societies were, I almost want to say there's like an analogy here of the sort of there's a it's sort of fun because I have the English part of my family, my ancestry, is the Castmores, and it's an old Anglo-Saxon name which has various variations. Funnily enough, in Game of Thrones, you have the Castemirs. It's the
mm,
same name, and it means castleman. So you've got Castmore, Castamore, Castamere, Castmere, Cashmere, Cashmore. It goes on, but it's all basically the same name. It means castleman in Anglo-Saxon. And the motto of the family is without God, castles are nothing. And I feel like that ties a little bit into what happens here with England, that she sort of betrays God for a castle and then a castle for a pot of stew. Like, it kind of just
mm,
goes downhill from there. And I feel like it's like where she sort of sells out the faith in order to have this nationalist religion, essentially nationalist dream.
mhm,
And then she ends up losing that too. And then it loses identity, and it's all deeply deeply tragic to me. So with regards to the story being told here, it's the beginnings of this,
mhm.
because I think we should remember just how bad the American Revolution was for Britain. um your picture went away.
Sorry, my camera just died. I'm here though.
Oh, you're here.
I'm here.
Yay.
Let me just
um
I'm gonna back out 1 second and I'll come back, but I'm gonna have to be on a different
sure.
it's gonna be on a different camera. Brighter. Sorry about that.
Hello, the light.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it was a situation where I think a lot of people forget just how bad the American Revolution was for Britain, in terms of not just economic merely or anything else, but also a sense of self was being taken away because they really did identify themselves in many ways by this widespread of empire. And hey, look, they had just conquered Canada not too far before, so that gave them something to balance off of. And there was other stuff happening. I'm not saying it was completely nothing, but that was different than losing your own nurtured colonies, in the sense of this was the children, not the conquered entities. It was different.
Yeah, you get the
Um,
sense too that there's like a real full disclosure here, my extent of studying this, and it's been many years, is Boswell's Life of Johnson. And
mhm,
there's these like wonderful interactions where Boswell is arguing with Johnson, and Johnson, being that staunch Tory that he was
mhm.
very much against the independence of the Americans. Whereas with Boswell, you can see that he's actually somewhat sympathetic to the American arguments for independence. And it's wonderful little interactions that you have between the two of those. And I think it's somewhat telling of what was actually being felt by themselves, because there was this like with Johnson, it was very clear, like, we this is our colonies, right? Like you said, we bore these
Right.
colonies into existence, and now these ungrateful um redheaded stepchildren. Johnson has a way with
Mhm.
words with certain things, right? But these ungrateful little children are like turning around to bite at us, and
Yeah.
whereas you can see with Boswell, no, it's much more sympathetic from his point of view towards.
And what I would actually say, this is something that goes down in the book a lot, about the different perspectives going on in Britain at the time. I would say a lot of it was not so much sympathy with independence as much as sympathy with the arguments being made for representation or
Mhm.
other things like
That's
that.
true.
So, in other words, there was lots of people who I'm thinking. I mean, I just finished I do transcribing, in case you've noticed. I was just doing another transcribing project, with the letters of Major Patrick Ferguson. And he was a famous British, Scottish born um, officer who was killed at the Battle of Kings Mountain in South Carolina. I visited his grave when I was down there. But he was sympathetic to colonial arguments for different things, representation, and different complaints they had about certain heavy handed measures being used by the British government. He was sympathetic until, I mean, he very plainly sort of said, and I paraphrase, until they killed my friends and crippled my arm,
Mhm.
which I think was very fair, honestly. It was kind of like, until you essentially took up arms against the king. That's going too far, even if you have legit grievances. And until you start to kill and maim the king's soldiers, then I'm done. And for him, that was the way it was, and that was the way it was for a lot of people. It was kind of a cutoff point once that sort of violence was taking place. And this is, I mean, very interestingly, I mean, Lord Cornwallis had the same views, was very
Mhm.
sympathetic as a Whig toward the colonials. The Howe brothers almost didn't go at all. They were kind of like, well, maybe we'll conscientiously object. And then eventually they went. But you had plenty of people who were like that and were just
You
kind of
actually had
like,
Edmund
hey,
Burke, which I find Burke to be a fascinating, that he was sympathetic to the Americans, whereas he was clearly, in
yeah.
his wonderful reflections on the French Revolution, not sympathetic to the French Revolution. So, yeah, no, it's an interesting
He felt
dynamic
they
there.
went off the beam. He felt they went
Mhm,
completely off the beam. And again, with Burke, though, I mean, see, again, I want to stress that most of these guys were not in favor of independence. Even like that was a very tiny minority until
mhm.
like everything starts falling apart. See, so there was this sort of dynamic in the beginning. Most of these guys, they were not saying we actually are in favor of the rebellion. But what they were saying is the government has handled things so badly from their point of view Like,
Mhm.
what do you expect? And we should have done it so differently and just, blah, 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 given them this, that, or the other thing, conceded in various ways. Now, the Tories would respond, there's all kinds of problems if you just concede to everything that are actually going to, cause, issues. So they had their own, rationale. I find the more that I write about it, read about it, and write about it, I think both sides of the kind of political spectrum and how they viewed the colonial complaints from Britain had valid points to make. I think
Mhm.
the Whigs had valid points to make in saying sometimes concessions are a good thing and updating the empire is not always bad. But I think that the Tories also had valid points about the complexity of how representation would even work for colonies, and also the fact that, frankly, directly taxing your colonies was the norm. It wasn't just some weird tyrannical thing that the British decided to do on a weird weekday.
Mhm.
It was something that was being done, pretty much by all European powers. If anything, Britain was more lenient and lax than her sister powers. So it's very much of a situation where nobody was the villain, coming. This is the
Mhm.
the big bad tyrannical for. It wasn't that way. It was people with different perspectives within the context of their time. And one of the things, though, that I think ties in thematically to the wider question is the fact that you had many people, including King George, including General Burgoyne, Major Ackland, who also features in the story, was vocal about this as well, and he in fact says it in the sequence I give to him and Burgoyne in Parliament, where they're saying if we lose America, it will come back to bite us. It will come back to bite us because we will be eclipsed by her.
Mhm.
It was a very haunting statement where it was like we either hang together as an Anglosphere, as an empire, or we fracture and we get eclipsed. It is a matter of survival. And I think that has proven to be correct.
Mhm.
In the long term, it did. And it's haunting to see it that way. But I think one of the most haunting elements and something that really is the fundamental theme of the series is just how much from the British experience, the American Revolution paralleled the split from the church. It was almost like a form of karma. You commit
Mm.
a schism and you built everything on a schism, and all of a sudden you get taken down by a schism. Something that was bloody. And I try to lean into how the parallels of that. That there's this deeply bloody schism when it comes to the breaking up and the sundering of Christendom.
Yeah, I would say,
And
what's
there's
interesting about that, I
yeah,
haven't thought about it before, but now that you bring it up, there's some parallels too because, whereas after the Reformation in England, there were certain parties that wanted to go, more towards the extreme sides of the Reformed, and then there were others who wanted to return towards, the certain Catholicity. You almost have like a real parallel between that, between like the Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian arguments,
yeah,
where you have with
yeah,
Hamilton a real like reverence and a real desire to to bond England and the new American government as closely as possible. Whereas with Jefferson, he wants to go more towards the model of the French Revolution and that sort of
yeah,
egalitarianism.
yeah, and you can see that with regards to also like John Adams as well, in his
Hmm.
leaning more toward a kind of we still have bonds to Mother England in our own way and
Hmm.
that kind of thing. Um, which it's always one of those things though that it's tricky. I always feel like some of the special relationship language does come off a bit like a couple that's had a really bitter breakup, but they keep saying they're just friends.
Yeah.
Like, I think we authentically do have a special relationship, but it's not the kind of just friends relationship that some people kind of use. It's more complex and
Hmm.
emotionally tumultuous. It's kind of it's like actually closer to what Protestants and Catholics, I would say, on the wide,
Hmm.
or Orthodox, the brokenness of Christendom.
Hmm.
So it's not without its own bitterness. It's a bittersweet relationship. It's not simply, oh, well, now we're friends. It's not.
It's
There's
kind of funny
something
because I'll find myself with certain people, well, if I'm dealing with like an Anglican, for example, I'll find myself like vehemently arguing with them about something. Whereas if I'm dealing with somebody else who's like trash talking the Anglicans, I tend to defend I tend to like come to their defense,
same.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. No, same because well, I mean, it's sort of funny. I was just talking about this recently. Um, that in a number of books I've run into, which I don't want to give the names to because I'm connected to a lot of authors.
Mm,
But basically, you do run into this sometimes from other Protestant groups completely. Who I observed this where they're like trashing the Anglicans worse than I do at all, in terms of representation of Anglicans within my series. I
mhm,
actually try very hard to be fair to Anglicans. And some of the best characters, in my opinion, in the trilogy are some of the Anglican characters. So I'm not sort of just doing this sort of like one-dimensional vilification of them or anything. But I noticed that that is done sometimes even by their fellow Protestants because they don't consider them Protestant enough.
mhm.
So it's interesting that way.
Well, we're
And it
gonna
is
link Well, we're going to link everything in the descriptions below where we can find all of your works and all of the things
thank you. I
that
really
you have out there.
appreciate that.
Mhm. And I wanted to know before I'm going to have to wrap up here pretty soon, but before we go, is there anything that you'd like to plug? Is there anything that you're working on that people should be
Sure.
keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, so I mean, I run Fellowship in Fairy Dust, the magazine that we mentioned in the beginning. So we're always sort of trying to put together issues and things. We've been having technical problems lately because we had a terrible hack.
Mhm.
So things are a little bit scattered in terms of our web presence. But if you can Google us, we're around. We've got plenty of material floating about. Um, but we do anthology print publications as well that are available for sale on Amazon. We're actually about to release our issue on the theme of early America. So we're
Mm.
doing a lot of like early American history. We've done a lot of different themes in the past, everything ranging from like the Inklings to Celtic things to the Middle East. I mean, we've done pretty much every theme conceivable almost, ranging, because we do the wide sort of scope of the liberal arts. So it can
Mm.
range from like fandom, fantasy kind of thing to history and everything in between. Um, so that is always going on, and we always welcome submissions of content. So there is that. In terms of, as we mentioned, my books, what is for sale currently on Amazon, you can find by looking up Avellina Balestri. My first book in the Robin Hood series, Saplings of Sherwood, which is Robin's origin sort of story, from when he is a child to when he's in his mid-teens. So that's the first book, and the second book is underway, Small Apples Grow. So I'm working on that currently. And also available on Amazon, the first book of the trilogy, Gone Forth Soldier, which takes Ned, our character, to about the halfway mark, roughly speaking, of the Saratoga campaign, and then I'm working on the sequel to that, Kingdom of Wolves. So that's also underway. I'm about to release also a second poetry book. So I have the first poetry book that's available, Pendragon's Shield, and in just a few days, which should be coming out. Maybe it will be out, in fact, by the time
Cool.
this interview goes live. Torn by Grace, which is the secondary, poetry collection that I've done. Also available on Amazon in addition to the F&F anthologies that I've participated in. I was actually part of an anthology project put on by a friend of mine, Bilal Muhammad, about Christ in Islam, and I was picked to be the Christian representative for that. So it's basically me and a bunch of Muslims all talking about perspectives on Jesus. So that was a very interesting project to be a part of. A lot of just interesting angles and things like that. It also has a lot of interesting material in terms of people are interested in Jesus as he appears in Islamic hadiths. There's a lot of that Bilal collected and just put together in the beginning of the book.
Mhm.
It's called The Good Shepherd, and that's available as well. My essay in it and everybody else's. So it's very, very interesting reading. And lastly, in terms of projects, which I suppose ties in a little bit more to that project, is a sort of it's probably going to end up being two things actually, both a screenplay and possibly like a novel slash novella. So like kind of two formats of the same thing, which is called River of Milk, and it deals with the 7th century Battle of Karbala in what is modern day Iraq.
Mhm.
So that's something that I'm working on. It's one of those back burner projects a little bit, which I feel bad about because I put a lot of time researching it and taking notes on everything. So I actually need to turn back to that. But that is also in the works. So that's one of those projects that is ongoing.
Well, that's wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the channel and join us. And I'd like to get you back on at some point because we really didn't get a chance to dive too deeply into Robin Hood. But as
I would love
a
to do a sequel. I would love to do a sequel interview if you want to plan
Mhm,
one, some like next month or whatever, some month down the
mhm.
line, and do something on we really lean into Robin more. That would be awesome.
Yeah, no, that's it's my wheelhouse. It's my area. I mean, not Robin Hood particular, but England in that period is a particular area of
Yes.
interest for me.
Oh
Whereas I
yeah,
kind of
we could do Robin Hood, King
Mhm,
Arthur, and like stuff pertaining to more crusades, Richard the
mhm,
Lionheart, but also I mean, my hobby horse. Not to go off on this whole thing. One of my hobby horses is also King Henry VI from
mhm,
the War of the Roses period.
mhm.
I am sort of a proponent for his canonization, so we could definitely go there in terms of medieval stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that'd be great.
endless possibilities.
Yes. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Avelita. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really enjoyed it. God bless.
Yes. God bless you.